Hello, everyone, and welcome to NYCFC House for today's very special Chalk Talk. My name is Donnie Kwok. I'm an editor at The Ringer. It's a website started by a gentleman named Bill Simmons. Hopefully you read some of our articles, watched our videos, listened to our podcast. We have a soccer podcast called Ringer FC. Does anyone call you Donnie?
No.
No.
How's it going, by the way? How's The Ringer doing, and how's Bill doing, and all that stuff?
Well, we're about a year in, and I think we're doing pretty well. But this isn't about us. This is about you.
Trying to distract the conversation over here.
They call me the Ringer Don, and I'm with the Soccer Don. I'm very honored to be here with MLS Commissioner Don Garber. Welcome.
Thank you.
I guess my first question is, you've just taken a tour of this NYCFC house. I believe it's your first time here?
It is, yeah.
So just what are your impressions?
I think it's fantastic. You know, I think a lot about the evolution of our league from our founding in '96 to what we called MLS 1.0, and then we went through lots of changes in 2006, 2007, the beginning of expansion. We call that MLS 2.0, and this really is MLS 3.0. You know, to think that we have a club in a city where we've always wanted to have an urban-based team, particularly in New York City. The fact that we're down in a very cool part of town and a brand-driven location like this that represents everything that we want MLS to be, it's over-delivered. I heard a lot about it. Happy to be here today. I live a couple blocks away.
Oh, you do?
So I do. So
wow.
An easy commute
nice.
For me. There
Very
you go.
nice. Yeah, I mean, if you guys haven't seen, there's a downstairs and
Very
there's
cool.
a rooftop and there's office space, so it's a really nice space. Speaking of the club itself, this is NYCFC's in its third season. You mentioned, you talked a little bit about it, but you know, how is it panning out? Is it meeting your expectations, and what does having a team here in the 5 boroughs, like how significant is that for the league?
You know, it's a good question because, you know, your expectations evolve over time. So when the league came, the team came in a couple of years ago, it was the culmination of what was almost 20 years of work to figure out how we wanted to lay out the landscape for Major League Soccer. And most people don't know, I don't think the media knows this, when the league was founded, we had a vision for 2 teams in New York City. And the Red Bulls were playing in Giant Stadium and then ultimately in their new stadium. But the original plan had 2 teams in New York and 2 teams in LA. And here we are with our second team in New York, just a few years old, and our new team in Los Angeles coming in next year. But when we thought about it in my early days, 1999, 2000, we were just in such a different spot that we couldn't imagine being where we are today with this club. You know, I travel around the city. The MLS office is here in New York City. I live here. I see lots of NYCFC branded gear, hats and T-shirts. It used to be when I'd see an MLS logoed kid running around, I'd turn to my son or daughter, or I'd turn to my wife and say, you know, hey, there's a Red Bull shirt, or there's a Chicago Fire shirt, and it was a big thrill. But now you see this brand represented in this city, and it's part of sort of the culture of the soccer movement here in New York. So it's been great. The team obviously has been successful. I've said this for many years. I thought the brand execution is as good as any brand launch in professional sports in any league. I love the logo. I remember when I originally saw it, it just kind of hit me at hello, that subway token feel.
That's the pigeon.
And I just heard about the pigeon a few minutes ago. I wasn't aware of that. I'm not a big fan of pigeons, being a New Yorker, but I'm gonna buy one of those T-shirts, and I'll proudly wear the pigeon on my chest. But the club's playing well. We love Patrick and the job that he's done. John's been a great addition to this team and getting it more deeply connected into the movers, powers, and shakers in New York. We're so thrilled to have the City Football Group as owners in MLS. Yankee Stadium's been working reasonably well. We continue to work hard to try to support whatever soccer-specific stadium efforts can come over the next couple of years. But so far, you know, knock on wood, it's great, and it's actually over-delivered.
Yeah. Speaking of stadiums, getting into kind of an overview of this MLS season so far, maybe general assessment of how the season is going, and obviously Atlanta opened their stadium quite recently, and it was a big news event and a lot of fanfare, and actually really a great time, I think.
You know, growth and managing growth has been fun for us. So the league is going through this next phase, which is about new teams and new stadiums and broadening our fan base and getting more media coverage and getting more important in areas where it really matters for us to influence the way people think about soccer in America and Canada, the way they think about our league. So this year was another really good one. 2 new teams, as you know, Atlanta and Minnesota. Both teams doing really well. Atlanta is kind of shocking the entire sports community. We'll have 45,000 sold out in the new stadium on last weekend. They'll have 45,000 tomorrow night. They'll have north of 70, we think, on Saturday. So 3 games within 10 days, and it'll be the highest attended local sports team other than the NFL in professional sports. Not something that we really expected to happen. The new stadium in Orlando has been fantastic. Our attendance is up, our television ratings are growing, so it should be another record-setting year.
Right. One new wrinkle this season is video review, and talking to some of the fans here earlier, it seemed to be a topic that people wanted to talk about. There is going to be an audience question part after this, but I'm curious if you feel, how you feel about video review, a work in progress, a success, anywhere in between?
Well, it's early, but the early launch was very successful. And again, you would expect somebody like me to say that. You're not going to be critical.
It's not an abject failure.
In its first 30 days. But I met with Peter Walton yesterday. There was a game that took place in Seattle, probably an opportunity for VAR to turn a decision. Wasn't turned, and I think that's part of showing the fan and showing the deeply rooted soccer community that VAR isn't necessarily a silver bullet. Right. Still allows the official, in this case a video official, to make a decision with the aid of technology and make the decision or make the determination as to whether they want to change the view of the official on the field. But it goes back to the official, in this case, looked at the screen. I think many people thought he probably should have not called a red card or a second yellow, but he did, and everybody supports it. You might get some noise in social media or even from ownership in that case. But overall, it's been working well. I think it was a good brand driver for MLS to be a leader in that. There's been articles written around the world about how we have had a successful launch and there have been some challenges in other countries. I think it's the beginning of a new phase of technology in our sport. I'll just add, to me, this is just the beginning of how we could be a leader in technology. FIFA has been loath in the past to allow its leagues really to put microphones in the grass, to get parabolic mics close enough to the field so you could really hear the players and not just hear the crowd. I've seen rugby matches where officials have had GoPro cameras, and I've always been amazed that FIFA, the most powerful body in sport, doesn't want to be leading all of that. And I think our league and others pushed technology with VAR. We're going to push technology on our broadcast, push technology for data collection with our players. I'd love to see, though I don't know that our players would like it, when David is about to take a penalty kick, to have a meter on him and to see what happens on air to his heartbeat as he's lining over
it's like
that.
Playing FIFA.
Or put it on Sean Johnson, who
Controller
had, the game of the season, even though it was a loss this past weekend, and see what it's like throughout that game to measure all that stuff that people are doing on themselves. Why would you not want to do it on a top, world-class athlete? So VAR is just the beginning for me, at least. I hope.
It reminds me, I believe I heard you interviewed once where you were talking about one of the frustrations of being the commissioner is that unlike in other leagues, for example, like Gary Bettman, right, he can change rules within his sport, but you're beholden to FIFA in many ways. If you were head of FIFA, what are some things, or what's the first thing you would do?
The world would be a little bit different, I think. But no, I think it's both a challenge, but it's also a benefit. Right? We're part of the global game, the beautiful game, and the fact that we are all connected to the sport in a global community. Our players are registered to be transferred around the world. We have the opportunity to sign players from hundreds of different countries. We have the ability to have club and country, national team play, Sean getting called into the Gold Cup, and then a week later he's playing in Yankee Stadium. So all of those things come with the value of a FIFA, who is the governing body for the sport, but it is run by folks that are less innovative, if you will, than league commissioners are. I mean, we're tasked with growing the game, making it more important, getting more fans, developing more players, utilizing all the assets and resources we have to be focused on how does MLS get better. And I'm not really that concerned about what impact that might have on a league in Saudi Arabia, because we have the ability to do it here. And it's frustrating we can't make those decisions entirely on their own. I will say, to finish this, a young president at FIFA, a guy that came out of the commercial side in Europe, Gianni is way more, I think, focused on trying to bring the game to...
More than Sepp Blatter?
More than Sepp, who could have been, our grandfather as an older guy. I mean, not, a lot of challenges at FIFA, but Sepp was almost 80 years old. Gianni's 45. He just thinks about sport differently, and I think we'll be able to take advantage of that.
I'm guessing a question you get asked a lot is obviously about expansion. You were just talking about Atlanta, and obviously Minnesota came this year, and 2 more teams next year, and then ultimately to 28. What's the latest that you can give us on those efforts?
Well, next one's coming in LA, and they're really doing well. And I think a number of folks here have visited what they've put together in their version of NYCFC House. They have one in downtown Los Angeles where they have the similar situation. By the way, it's not quite as nice as this one. It's not quite as large, but it's pretty cool. And they're very forward-thinking in how they're collecting data and connecting to fans as a launch of a new team, with the ability of going into a new stadium when they launch. That'll come in next year. As you probably have heard, Miami is getting closer and closer to becoming a reality. Our owners have approved us working with them to try to get a deal closed. I expect to do that. And then we'll pick 2 new teams by the end of the year. 16 or 12 of them are still in the running. We'll figure out where that ends up, and then 2 more
no
teams
exclusive news here? No.
Not for you, Danny. No, sorry.
We'll get to you guys' questions shortly. I'm curious what, the league now is, healthy, and there's a lot of momentum, as you've discussed. I'm wondering if there's like a certain prevailing or misconception that remains about the league that irks you amongst people that maybe don't follow it as closely as regular fans.
It's a good question, and I'll start with, you're never going to have everybody believe, right? Our goal is to have people give Major League Soccer the credit that is due, hold us to task on those things that we need to do better. And as an emerging business, I say this about people in life, I say this about any individual company. Some people here work for the club, but some work for businesses. You've got to constantly innovate and constantly push, and the minute you think you've cracked the code is the minute it all comes tumbling down. So there's an energy, a looking over our shoulder, and there's a sense of if we don't do it today, who's going to do it because it won't get done kind of energy around the league. And I think that's going to exist for a long time. We're still in a growth phase. The league's not fully mature. It's going to be many, many years, probably long after I'm commissioner, when we'll reach that point of growth where now it's just a matter of how do you get to be better. And that's what basically all the other leagues are, though the NHL is looking at expansion in 2 different markets. So we look at the size of the soccer audience in North America. It's massive. We've got a small percentage of that we still need to grow into, if you will. A small percentage of those we don't have are haters. And they're always haters are going to hate.
Haters.
You guys have heard that, right? And in our case, you have people that are engaged in the sport in ways that are not necessarily connected to their local club.
The Euro snobs?
They've been described that to me in the past, but the research that we've shown, it's a very small percentage of the market that we don't have. So we have a lot of growth in front of us from people who are just coming into being a fan in Cincinnati. Right. And they've never had a local team to support. Now they've got a USL club, they're packing the stands, they play in a US Open match, they have a historic event. Now they come connected to the professional soccer movement in the US or in Canada, and now that's fertile ground for us, as opposed to thinking that somebody that might have grown up because their parents might have been a Serie A fan or Juventus fan or a Man City fan, and now we've got to try to convince them to be a New York City fan. There's more than enough people out there for us to grow our fan base. There's a massive, massive market, and we're just going to work to continue to get there.
I think speaking of misconceptions maybe about the league, I think one thing a lot of people used to think about MLS or describe it as is like a retirement home for kind of aging stars. And I think that came to light actually recently because there was news that Zlatan Ibrahimovic was going to LA Galaxy, which would seem in line with moves like Lampard or Gerrard, etc. And it ended up not happening, and the Galaxy signed Jonathan Dos Santos, and I think Carlos Vela is coming next season. And I think overall it kind of indicates that, you know, the designated player is being used in different ways as MLS goes into 3.0. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. I think if Zlatan was going to, if he was healthy and he re-signed and played another year with Man U, there'd be European clubs that would chase after him, and nobody would look at Man U and saying it's a retirement club. So that's one of the challenges that we've got to manage. It's part of the reality of being an emerging league and having to continue to make decisions that affect the brand perception. And that's something we just have to deal with every day. But you have to be mindful about it. We've got to be better at communicating the fact that the average age of the DPs that came in this year were 25.3. I mean, that's really, really young. It's probably younger than any group of leagues that have signed players in transfer around the world. So that's a part of our own messaging. And it's a part of that, you know, we still have a bunch of guys that are older. Eventually they'll cycle out, and you'll see more and more signings coming in the Carlos Vela or the Jonathan Dos Santos age category, and then you move on. But I will say this, you know, David's one of the older players in the league. To me, he's one of the best players in the history of our league, and some would argue he probably is. So, somebody say something? Oh, John? So,
somebody's agreeing.
So, you know, I think that you got to get to the point where individual decisions don't define your brand positioning. And that's just a part of being immature, because one or two things could knock that upside down. So if somebody said to us today, could you sign David today? I think you'd have teams around the world trying to sign him, and you'd have a lot of MLS teams who try to sign him several years after he signed with NYCFC.
That's a great answer. Speaking of youth, Christian Pulisic, Pulisic is how you say it, right? Pulisic. Sorry. Pulisic is obviously a name that everybody knows. One of the brightest stars, if not the brightest star in U.S. soccer. Obviously, he doesn't play in MLS. He plays for Borussia Dortmund. Do you envisage a day when an American player of his age and ability chooses to stay and play in MLS? And if not, I mean, what are the obstacles you foresee in making that happen? So, you know,
the quick immediate answer is I absolutely can have the vision that that will happen in time. I think we're going through a period now, and these time frames kind of evolve. You know, early on, and this would be interesting trivia for people, when I first came into the league, it was leading into the 2002 World Cup, and we sat down and we said, we need to have the best American players who will be, we knew that there was something happening with the national team. At that time, by the way, MLS owned the English language television rights for 2002 and 2006. We had a lot of organizational emphasis on making that big. So we went out and signed Landon, and we signed Brian McBride, and we signed Marcus Beasley and a bunch of other folks that were going to be the core of the national team, and we knew it could be part of a marketing campaign because there was very little competition. You know, the American player was not attracting the attention or the respect of the rest of the world. And that's beginning to shift. And in the last couple of years, you're seeing, you know, McKinney, and you're seeing Christian and a handful of others, many of them coming out of our academies, like McKinney in Dallas, who are being signed at young ages to go over to Europe. And Howard Wolfson, who's a season ticket holder and a friend of our league, has said, there's one player you could sign in your league, is bringing Christian back. You know, sell the building and get Christian back. And that's probably, if he's playing in our league, I think it would be incredibly exciting for us. But the question would be, would he have the international appeal if he was as successful in MLS as it is now that he's successful in Europe? And that dynamic is what we need to change. So I don't think about it as an individual player. I think, how do we get our league to be good enough or as good as the Bundesliga so that a player is not making that decision to go over there because it might be better, but maybe they're going to pay more money. Maybe he's of German descent and he wants to live in Munich or he wants to live in one of these other cities. And I think that time is going to come. I think you're going to see a merging of our player pool where the American player is going to be as valuable as the international players, and the competition for those spots are going to be hard between the international spots we have and the domestic spots we have. And I think that's within 10 years. You know, I really believe that that's happening in time. In the next 2 or 3 years, you know, we've got leagues, commissioners, got to think in 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 10-year time frames. Fans care about Sunday or Saturday. Right. And general managers care about their roster for next week's game. We're trying to think about how do we get our player pool to look what we need it to look like when the World Cup, we hope, is here in 26. Right. So it's just a different perspective.
What does go through your mind? I'm curious when you open the paper and see Neymar selling for X amount, 200 million, and Mbappe and Dembele and all of these guys.
It makes me feel good that these guys are investing what they're investing in an academy. And you know, I think Jonathan Lewis was not an academy player. I think he was a Generation Adidas player, somebody from the club. But think about that. You know, if you had a player coming out of your academies worth $100 million, you can do a lot with that $100 million. What's interesting, and again, this is inside soccer sort of stuff, but in our system, that money can get used for infrastructure, it can get used in building your brand, it can get used in buying and signing more players. What's happening in Europe now is they're just taking this massive pot of money and they're moving it around. It's really not doing anything to grow the game. Is PSG going to be any more valuable to the soccer or football community because they're going to have 4 of the best players in the world? I'm not so sure. If we had those players in MLS, you could see the water level rising really high. Some kid's going to grow up near your academy and they're going to look through and they're going to see a young player that is starting or making a bunch of money or is on, you know, one of your interviews, and all that identity connection, all that sort of adulation thing, that's what develops, you know, where we need to be.
Are MLS academies and the homegrown movement, is that moving at a pace that you agree with, or is it?
Yeah, so it's moving a little faster than we thought in terms of the number of players signed, a couple hundred in a very short period of time. This whole system for us is just a few years old, you know, 4 or 5 years old. The mandate to go U14 is only a couple of years old, so it takes almost a generation to be able to go through that process. So the several hundred players are players that we have developed, that we didn't have to buy, that are not necessarily international players, so I think that's good for the US and Canadian national teams. What we haven't seen is a Pulisic come out of it. I've heard that Dortmund was offered tens of millions of dollars to sell him and turned it down. My guess is, and I've heard this from folks that are smarter at this than I am, that he could be that $50, $75, $80 million player sale type player. We haven't seen that yet. So economically, all that investment is still very much at a loss leader. There hasn't been any real, the last big sale we had was Josie Altidore that came out of the Red Bulls and was sold to Valencia. That was 10 years ago. Long time ago.
You mentioned in passing the World Cup 2026 bid. What will it mean for the MLS if it's awarded to the United States?
You know, it's a bit of a game changer. You know, that's hyperbolic. The best way to describe it in sort of real terms is MLS and the soccer movement in this country is an outgrowth of the '94 Olympics, World Cup. You think about still the most popular World Cup in history from an attendance perspective was in '94. It's a long time ago. So that gives us 8 years to put all of the building blocks in place to leverage how we can, because we're very integrated in terms of how we and the Federation and others are using the World Cup to grow the game. And that'll give us a true 8-year plan. Each year we'll have different benchmarks of what we need to do to be able to have the sport we want to have, not just the league, but the sport we want to have on January 1st, 2027. And we're working on that plan. So we're actually going to create a plan saying this is the North Star. What will soccer in America, Canada, and even Mexico look like? Maybe we have a joint competition amongst the 3 countries that's different than the Champions League. Maybe there's interleague play with Mexico. Maybe kids are staying in the game 1 or 2, boys and girls, 1 or 2 or 3 years later than they are today. Maybe we have all those cities that are bidding to host games make commitments. This is not a maybe. This will be a must. Make commitments to do development programs, facility programs, community-based programs, connecting with the NWSL clubs and the MLS clubs in each of these markets. If you want those World Cup matches, this is what you're going to need to do to contribute to the game. So I can go on and on and on. We're spending a great deal of our time on it. It's based in the MLS offices, the bid staff. Our folks are very integrated, and we're working our tails off on it.
Have you ever heard the argument that MLS is actually making non-American CONCACAF teams stronger?
And it's not just an argument, it's true,
Yeah.
right? But I think competition makes you better, right? The fact that the 2 goals that were scored in the qualifier were scored by MLS players. Right. So I don't think that's a bad thing, because ultimately there's no alternative, right? So what happens to that player if he's not playing in Houston and he's, maybe he's playing in Costa Rica in a league that's not as popular or not as valuable, or he's a third stringer in another country? I think that's ultimately good. It makes the Champions League more valuable. We need to take the US Open Cup and make the Champions League more valuable than it is today. If we want to be a real soccer nation, look at the FA Cup and look at all these other tournaments. I mean, that's what makes soccer the beautiful game. It's not just a league, it's all the other things going on around it. If people don't care about Costa Rica, then how are they going to care if we're going to be playing, one of their clubs in the Champions League?
Just to wrap up my questions, you alluded to it, how commissioners think in 2, 5, 10-year plans. So I guess we can pick a distance, 10 years? What are you seeing in 10 years? Or maybe 5 years, 5 to 10 years?
I think 10 years is a good period of time. We said by 2022 we wanted to be one of the top leagues in the world. And that came out of a 10-year plan that we had when we were bidding for the World Cup in 2010 for 22. And we went to our owners, with Sunil Gulati, who came to that board meeting and said, hey, here's what we think the country could look like if we got the World Cup. And we thought we had it, and we didn't. And rather than come back and tear that up, which I thought would have been weak, now we don't have it, therefore plan B, we kind of stayed with that. We went out, we did a lot of research about what we needed to do to improve the quality of the game. Where did we need to invest strategically? That's where targeted allocation money and general allocation money and the shifting of the designated player rule came out. All that comes out of planning. It's not just a bunch of folks sitting in their office saying, wouldn't this be cool? So the next 10 years we'll have similar type plans. What do we want the league to look like from a competitive perspective? We want to be winning the Champions League. That means we've got to be more competitive with Liga MX. Today they beat us regularly. We know why. We know how they spend their money, where we spend it, where those players are coming from, how much they invest in their academies. What does their competition look like? What does their calendar look like? How are they dealing with transfers? We know all that. So we want to be able to be at least as good, if not the top league in CONCACAF, which today we've got some work to do to achieve.
Great. I guess we'll open up to questions now. I'm not sure how. Should I be passing this mic?
Talk loudly.
You've spoken about growing the player pool both in depth and in width and incentives for cities to grow the game. What I'm curious about is, what is the league doing and what can the league do to really incentivize clubs to invest fully in the academy system? I want to hear about any actions y'all are taking, but especially as regards bright prospects from the academies skipping MLS entirely to go overseas with no compensation back to the club.
So it's a complicated issue, and it starts with, and again, I describe this a little bit as inside MLS, because this is deep, sort of under the covers. We in our country have labor requirements, and that you can't be a professional athlete until you're 18 years old. Around the world, FIFA's tried to create that, but Christian got around it. He became a professional underneath. His father basically had a Serbian passport, therefore it was under the European Union, so he was able to go over there at an age younger than we're able to sign a professional contract. So we've got that challenge. We have the second challenge, we have the college system here. And we've got to figure that out. We haven't been able to do that. I'm going to get to a specific answer. I want to lay the background here. So when you're an academy kid and you're playing in one of our academies, You have the choice of going to college and getting a free education. That could be a $200,000 or $300,000 benefit to you and your family. You also can get an education, which is a lifetime benefit for you and your family. Or you can leave and become a professional, and you may or may not ever make it as a professional. So how do we manage that? Do we get the NCAA to allow us to have our players, when they're in their academies or in the USL teams, not violate their status? We're trying to get that happen to make college soccer more popular. That's one way to create an incentive for players to stay. The second way is, how do we manage them on the roster? Right now, you got an easy way. You don't have to go through the draft. But are there financial incentives, which we look at? You know, could you get a Generation Adidas on, you know, ×2? So it's not just a stipend, maybe it's a bonus. Are there ways for us, and it's complicated, where does the USL fit in with this, with the teams that we have in that level? How do we move those players around? How are they treated on the roster? There are all sorts of complicated challenges. I don't think it's about the minimum salary. I mean, years ago I used to have to answer that question a lot. I don't think our minimum salary is an issue. Jordan Morris signed. You know, he makes a lot of money, and he signed. Our teams are going to pay what they need to pay a player to keep him here, as opposed to going over from Europe to Europe. The biggest issue we have is that those players are getting nicked from our academies before we even have a chance to sign them to that pro contract. And we need to figure out a way to address that. That's what happened with McKinney. I mean, we spent years developing that guy. He's now over in Schalke. By the way, he got a nice nudge to go to Schalke. So I think we've eliminated a little bit of that. I don't think there's any resistance to players playing in our league on our national team as there might have been in the past. So there were forces that were making it even harder for us to sign those players, and I feel a little better about that. I will say, and you should feel good about this, a lot of ownership time and competition committee time is spent trying to figure this out. Very focused on it.
Excellent question.
You said you want to expand the league, you know, having lots of teams. For example, New York City, it took you guys like 20 years to have 2 New York teams. For example, before the Red Bulls, it was New York, New Jersey Metro Stars. Then they decided to change their names. Years then, 2015, NYC came. So right now you already have 2 New York teams. You also have 2 LA teams. Have you thought of from any of the cities that have one MLS team, have you thought about having another team for that particular city?
You know, I saw something, and I'm trying to remember it as I'm answering the question about rivalries. You know, in the beginning, I thought people were saying how they thought we manufactured these rivalries. And you don't hear that now with the New York City and the Red Bull games. I mean, they're real games. And there's a real drama to them, and there's a real energy to the rivalry games within rivalry week. But we needed to create that dynamic, because unlike English football, where you had 100 years of 5 teams in London or something like that, neighborhoods were competing against each other. So we believe that there are markets that could support more than one team, in LA and New York are the 2 that we've earmarked. I don't see us having second teams in other cities. And that's in my purview. I mean, who knows what it'll look like 20 years from now. But I do think we can get the rivalry thing in other markets better. Dallas and Houston should be a great rival. The cities are rivals. Minnesota and Chicago, they're pretty close to each other. There are lots and lots of different cities that could have stronger, more passionate rivalries. One of the things that we've done in research and looking at how rivalries have worked in other leagues, a lot of it is driven just by history. The Philadelphia Eagles and New York Giants have had a lot of really competitive playoff matches that have the Yankees and the Mets, who had a Subway Series. So with a young league, it's hard to have a lot of history. You got to kind of create that history, but you got to be careful not to do it artificially, and then we'd lose credibility.
Continuing on expansion, you mentioned the success of the last 4 expansion teams. Did that impact or like change the timeline at all for adding in the new teams, seeing the New York City FCs and the Atlanta being really successful on the field? Did that sort of show you that you could expand a bit more rapidly than you maybe
Yeah, you don't know really what comes first. It's an interesting question. We haven't kind of put a lot of sort of teeth into trying to understand what has driven the momentum that we're on. A lot of the momentum, it really speaks to what's driving growth, right? So is it the success of the teams that have come in, that are of New York City coming in, that's got Minnesota excited, or is it this movement? I actually believe it's the latter. I think if you look around the demographics of the people in the room, it's diverse, it's young, people that have grown up with the sport. Maybe you played, maybe you're part of some connection to the game, and you're coming in and you're not necessarily fans of other professional sports in our country. Early on, we didn't have that potential. The millennial, I know most of you are, you don't like to be described that way, but your age group has sort of come up into becoming consumers all at the same time. It's not just MLS that's benefiting by it, it's technology companies that are benefiting by it, and all sorts of things that are feeding the wants and desires of young people. What's really interesting is that the research we've shown is that the numbers of young people that are fans of other professional leagues and MLS is very small. The crossover between Atlanta United and Atlanta Falcons season ticket holders, the same stadium, less than 3%. So think about that. That's a shocking statistic. Seattle, which is a very popular football team, Seattle Sounders fans, less than 3% of those fans are fans of the football team, or at least ticket holders. In NYCFC, we've done some surveys. I don't know if you, I'm sure we got it from you guys. The percentage of people that had bought their first ticket in Yankee Stadium of your ticket holders is like 60, 70%. Most of the people who are going to your games never been to a Yankee game. It's shocking. So that stuff is what's driving the interest. Then you add the national team energy, the international games that are being played here. The World Cup is more popular. Women's soccer's got its own now 5-year league. It's all kind of going into the pot, and that's creating opportunity. And smart people are going to capture opportunity. And that's really what MLS is trying to do, to build this so that we could put it up there, and at some point it's just really great. I'll go around. I've got plenty of time. So say I only live a few blocks away.
As a former Euro snob, I first want to congratulate you about the work that you've done with the league. I mean, you've won me over and many others.
It's great. It's good to hear. Thank you.
The one beef I still
How do we
have,
get all your friends to say the same thing?
the one beef I still have with the league is the not taking breaks for the international windows. Like when David Villa gets called from Spain, as an NYCFC fan, you're kind of, you're excited, but also you're like, oh, he's going to miss games. I know it's now sort of up to the clubs to do it. Do you see that policy changing?
Yeah, I'll, again, I was reminded by Dan Cordemonch, who's our long time communications guy, that nothing's ever off the record. If we're up to me, I would make it mandatory. I think when you have some teams make the decision to take the break and others not, that level of inconsistency creates a competitive imbalance. And leagues need to be competitively balanced. I don't even mean by wins and losses. You need to have the same rules for everybody. The challenge that we have, and it's driven by the immaturity of our league, in that we're playing in this very confined window, across a lot of time zones, across a lot of weather issues, and we're the only league that plays by this calendar other than, I think, Russia and maybe some other Scandinavian leagues. And that forces us to have our breaks, even in the summertime, our games during the international breaks. So then the question is, do you have fewer games? If you have fewer games, from a revenue perspective, there's impact, but maybe it's better for your product. But then you get into the situation of already our players are on the shortest calendar of any other national or any other country. So now you have national team players. What do they do during that period of time? So it's a big challenge. I will say we have one guy's been in the league since its founding, who manages our schedule. It's the most difficult job in pro sports. It is computer algorithmic driven, but the numbers of issues with Yankee Stadium that we have is just an example, not to pick on you guys. So you have issues still with stadiums. You have now three NFL stadiums. We don't want to play on football lines. So how do you deal with those windows? And you got all sorts of challenges. So I don't think it's going to get solved quickly. I do think that there's going to be a time, probably sooner rather than later, where we're just going to have to stop, in my opinion.
You've talked a lot about wanting to grow the league to make it sort of higher in the standings in terms of world football. I think that's something we all want. But the question is sort of how to get there. The league itself, has set up a number of financial controls, which have been great, I think, to get the league as financially stable as it is now in this 3.0 version, as you discussed. But I think some of those financial controls could be holding the league back. Like, for instance, the minimum salary, which I don't necessarily think gets looked at a lot as sort of the DPs, is $65,000, maybe up to $70,000 or so by the time the CBA ends in 2019. But you compare that to NFL, which is $450,000. Major League Baseball, $500,000 plus. Basketball, $500,000. League MX, it's tough to tell exactly what the minimum salary is there, but
that's a different market. Yeah.
Median salary, somewhere around $200,000, compares to double that what MLS is. So I'm curious, one, specifically how you sort of look at that aspect of it in terms of the minimum salary, but also what other financial controls are currently in place that you think are going to be some of the best ways, but by loosening some of those guidelines, are going to be the best ways to be growing our league across the world.
So it's, as you can imagine, lots and lots and lots of time is spent thinking about this and trying to manage the economic reality of our revenues with the economic requirements of investing properly in our product so that we can attract new people to the game and have existing fans, believe in their club. And the system is what drives all those decisions. What people get confused, I don't hear it as much now as I used to years ago. You folks probably never use that word single entity like they used to many years ago. The entity just gives us the ability to make strategic decisions together about how we want to allocate our resources. And how do you do that in a way where you're managing losses, which, as you know, exists in MLS in a big way in many markets, and yet, so you got to be concerned, if you're me, about viability. We've been very stable, so there's always that thing hanging over my shoulder saying don't do too much because you don't want to put yourself in a situation like what's happening in the NASL and USL. Teams are coming and going all day long, right? They could spend whatever they want, right? There's no restrictions there at all. So it's not the restrictions that are the issue. It's basically how do you make the decisions that you need to make to ensure that you're properly investing in everything. So you'll look at it as a fan as well, you should, is what are you investing in players? I'm looking at it as what are they doing in players, what are they doing in marketing, what are they doing in having great staff, investing in real people, having a world-class coach, getting the right academy, building the facility up in Westchester, putting money aside to build a several $100 million stadium in somewhere here in the 5 boroughs. All of that goes into the pot, and just here in New York City, has got to get stirred around. What you should feel good about is our competition people are not thinking about all that. They're just thinking about investing in growing the quality of our player pool. And we do it in a very scientific way. We've rated every player in the league. That player is assigned a point or a point system. There's a dollar amount that's applied to that point. We have a code, every single MLS player, and we've compared them to the top 5 leagues in the world in Mexico. And we know what we need to do to get our numbers of 5 over to 4 and over to 3 and over to 2 and over to 1. And if you look at it on a color code, you can imagine in Spain, lots and lots of 1s and 2s and 3s. You look at an MLS, not that many 1s and 2s, maybe some 3s. So we've got to carefully invest to move those boxes along the way over a period of time, recognizing as the Commissioner of the League, your revenues are relatively fixed. So you have 2 choices. Get your owners to invest more, maybe they'll lose more money, or drive more revenue. And then that ultimately is what we spend a lot of our time thinking about. Last point I want to make, and it's a long answer to a very thoughtful question, is spending doesn't necessarily drive quality on a dollar-for-dollar basis. So in a market, you could move money around, and that doesn't necessarily create more value without the Champions League is League One, a higher quality league because PSG has spent 400 million euros on a bunch of players. You guys might have the answer to that question. I will tell you that their television ratings around the world are not going to go up much. PSG's will, and maybe PSG will win the Champions League. So just investing money doesn't necessarily give us exactly what we want. It's investing it in a very smart, in our system, way where the whole thing is moving up and creating a more attractive product. So, not sure I answered you. You got a look on your face saying, man, this commissioner is full of shit, man.
One part of this then, as you're sort of loosening the different financial controls recently, are you happy with sort of the pace of how you're increasing?
I think we're increasing it too fast. You know, I think we're spending with TAM, you guys know what TAM is, and general allocation money, we're spending more money now than we're required to spend in our CBA. That's the only professional league in the history of professional sports that is spending more money than we're required to. Why are we doing that? Because we want to grow our quality. But we want to do it in a way where we're ensuring that that money is being invested in a way that's growing the product that you could see as being more attractive to you. And we've done a lot of research on this. This is not just a bunch of folks sitting there like mad scientists. We go out and we research fans. We got a 20,000 person fan panel. What is it that means? What does quality mean? It's, by the way, it's not the number of touches. It's not as scientific as you would think. It's really, does this game look attractive to me? Are they scoring when they're in the 18-yard box? Are they booting the ball into the stands? Are they touching the ball in ways which I'm sure all of you have seen over the years? It used to be the ball would be kicked across the field and you would just hope that the guy would be able to trap it. And that's not an issue anymore. You just take it for granted the ball's going to move around. That's because our players are better. Now the question is, what needs to happen to get it to the next level? More goal scorers and more number 9s, more number 10s? Those are the kinds of things we're looking at. But I am feel better about it than we did.
You mentioned growing the league in terms of being a top 10 league in terms of soccer, but in terms of the American sports culture, what do you think needs to change and what can be done to increase the level of MLS to maybe meet where the NBA and MLB are now? And if you could highlight how the new TV deal may evolve in 2022, whether you think
Yeah.
media or media.
You know, it's a good question, and the best way to answer it in a short answer is time it's going to require a lot of time. You know, the research that we've done, at one point I was a marketing guy for the NFL. I ran their marketing program. We did a lot of research there too, trying to get an understanding of what created an NFL fan. And there were a number of things that you'd find very interesting. Their schedule is packed in most of the family events in your life. Back to school, Labor Day, Thanksgiving, Christmas, you know, New Year's. You got all these family events that are all in a very concentrated window that created a shared experience. So mothers and fathers and sons and daughters would sit around and watch a game together. That shared experience was generational. You're growing up in a home that was a fan of a football team or a fan of the Yankees. And that connection, we don't have a turn with you folks yet. You're new fans. So we have yet to have a full generational turn. We do have people now that have been born when MLS was in existence. That wasn't that long ago where we didn't have that. Most of the people came in and this league was sort of being born within their, you know, their sporting sort of experience. So we got to go through a couple more of those turns before I'll even be thinking about the baseball and the NBA or the NFL, which is a monster machine that seems immune to any issues that might exist in any aspect of their business because of this power of the things that they have that drive their core connections. So time is going to be that. I also think you folks are growing up. You're going to become influencers. So the expansion movement that we have now, I had Kevin Johnson in my office yesterday as the former mayor of Sacramento. He's a great NBA player. He was a mayor. And he's trying to bring a team to his city because he grew up in an environment where soccer was a part of his life, where he even said to me yesterday, 10 years ago, I never even thought about it. We have in our Miami team a very, very well-known NBA player that's looking to be an investor there. He grew up in a market where he just was connected to the game. We have Guys like Kobe Bryant who go to U.S. national team games all the time. So you're starting to see that influence happening. That'll drive value. But this is a long-term play. Fans don't want to hear that. I respect that. Media, you guys don't want to hear that, and I respect that too. That's your job, and you're not required to be thinking about anything about it. I want to see the best from my club and my league. But we're trying to think about what needs to happen over time. And that's a frustrating and difficult part of the job. You got to sort of turn your mind away from today and be thinking about tomorrow and years from now. It's frustrating.
How are we doing on time? Are we good?
Okay.
To have some more?
Sure.
Yeah? Okay.
As the league grows, like, you guys
5 more minutes, folks, because you don't think I'm cutting you off.
Yeah.
as the league grows, you guys have sort of laid out a relatively aggressive expansion timeline. I think you guys have one of the best playoff formats in sport. Do you see that having to change as well as potential realignment? Is that something you're looking at?
Yeah, realignment will have to happen. You know, it's part of our thinking is sort of getting, you know, our teams travel more than any other football teams around the world. A statistic from last year, the Vancouver Whitecaps traveled 60,000 miles. Think about when, you know, an ex-MLS employee is the CEO of Arsenal. Half of their guys are home for dinner at night after a game. So think about that. So we've got to be mindful of geography and mindful of more efficient travel, and I think that will happen in time. So geography, I think, will be a part of some of that change. What was the second part of your? Yeah, we love our playoff format. I mean, not everybody does. You know, I think the traditional core Euro fan doesn't believe in playoffs, right? Believe in other mechanisms, right? But our playoffs are necessary for us to compete with the other domestic leagues, where playoffs drive most of their economic value, most of their television ratings, most of their audience building happens in their postseason. Baseball's the best example of that. So we've been creating that dynamic, and it's been working pretty well. People are worried about where they are, where that line is. So I see it continuing to be important for us.
I guess my question goes back to media specifically and the 2022 contract. And you mentioned that the NFL is kind of immune to everything that's happening, but the ratings on Thursday Night Football were down 9% versus last year with the Patriots playing. They're having big issues. ESPN, which is a major provider of capital for many leagues, having massive issues. Disney, you know, taking their content out of Netflix, all kinds of stuff happening. And currently the MLS ratings still need to improve to make a pitch to companies, traditional and new media companies in 2020,
Yeah.
2022, to be able to, you know, demand an increase in that contract. My question is, what's the strategy there?
So let me ask you all a question. How many people have a cable account? So that's both good and telling, right? Sports consumers are still consuming content the way most people are. I think if you were going to go, I do this in school, I speak at a lot of schools, and you go to a typical business school class, how many people have, it's just in UCLA at their business school, how many people had cable account? It was like 5. Right? They weren't necessarily sports fans. It wasn't a sports business class. They're cable nevers, not even cable cutters. So sports content is live. It will always be live. And you're always going to require some delivery system. And you're always going to require some way that some number of entities are going to be utilizing, paying you for that content to achieve objectives. More subscribers, more ad revenue, or a better position on the cable spectrum, whatever it might be. Now, for the first time in my lifetime, now we went through a number of these changes. I've been in pro sports for over 30 years. I remember when ESPN came in, and it just shifted the entire sports media dynamic. Then Fox came in. Now all of a sudden you have extra bidders. Then all of a sudden you had digital DirecTV coming in. Now you had a crazy bidder. Then SiriusXM. There's always been things that have happened. Technology has driven a bunch of that have focused on sports as a way to deliver value. And now with Netflix and Amazon and all others, and baseball, what they just did with BAMTech, with Disney, all of that's going to create opportunity for all leagues to be able to have another go at it. What does it look like 25 years from now? We're probably selling our content directly to consumers. And we better be popular enough to be able to have enough consumers who are going to want to tune in to an NYCFC game and maybe go on their remote and pay $5 for the game. Now the challenge, and I think this is a long way away, by the way. I do think that the new ESPN contract, I think you might see in time some direct selling of program. I don't think that's in the short term, but I think that's going to happen within the foreseeable future. But I have a great sense of optimism, as do people that are willing to come in and buy expansion teams, that we'll look better in 2023 than we do in 2022. I will be very candid in saying I don't have a strategy for what it's going to look like 6 years from now, because I can guarantee if I did, it would change 5 times.
Maybe let's do 2 more.
Going back to, you said you want to increase quality of the game. One of the issues holding back, which I hear a lot from, like Euro snobs, like people like to call them, that come check out an NYCFC game, is how bad the officiating is. So what are you guys doing to better the refereeing in the MLS?
Well, it's an easy answer. We hired Howard Webb. If you guys haven't, has anybody been on our website to see the Howard Webb VAR presentation? You should. I think Howard Webb could be the next James Bond. He is, I remember him from the World Cup final, that Spain game where he missed, guy, De Jong, right? An ex-Galaxy player, kicked Spanish guy in the stomach. I asked him what happened there. I said, we didn't have VAR, so I missed it. But Howard really describes VAR in a way that is step 1. Really step 2, because step 1 is hiring a guy like Howard Webb. He's smart, he's a very forceful personality, he's a great official. I think it's his wife or his significant other that's the first female German official this past weekend. The second part is just all the things that you read about, investing in assessors, investing in training. We are the only league other than England that has a professional referee association based in MLS's office. Peter Walton is based in MLS's office, funded by the league, by Canada, and by U.S. soccer federations. And they're going through a very, very complete and comprehensive process. But like our players, like our teams, like our league office, it's developing as the sport continues to develop. I will say this, I get more owner emails, more fan vitriol, more social media stuff about officiating than I do about anything else. And it's not nearly as bad as people think it is. I think part of that is our broadcasters are fans, and they might look at a play and go ballistic on something being missed, and then we'll look at it the next day and say, what is that guy, what did he talk about? Because here's the actual panoramic camera view that we have in every stadium, and it was the right call. I think when we have incorrect calls, our officials should be fessing up on that. Me and Peter Walton disagree. I think me and the officiating community disagree, but I think they're human, they make mistakes, just like we all do every day. I think that will create a better dynamic perhaps, but I think we're far better, I'm sounding a little defensive, far better than I think fans, general managers, coaches, media people, and owners give us credit for.
Last question, I'll let you pick.
Woman in the back, sorry, you could ask me offline.
So I know you've had some social activism campaigns like Don't Cross the Line, and you've partnered with You Can Play. Recently the NBA announced that they're encouraging their players to be active in social issues, and I'm just wondering where you see the league's role in community activism and using players or allowing players to have their own voices.
It's a great thing to end on, and it's a great question, and shout out to the city football group that does a great job. I don't think Paul Jeffries is here today, right? But Paul is, I think, one of our top community relations directors. I don't know what's his title at the club as a community relations director. He's a real guy, a real person, and he's focused as a senior guy on that effort. We spend a great deal of our time. I hope will be my legacy. The league is going to grow with or without me, but I think that my focus has been to ensure that MLS works, punches above its weight, and starts as an umbrella organization, even when we were really small and young and were really struggling. We invested disproportionately to our resources in community programs, because I believe that sports teams, leagues, and players have to be good community citizens to have the kinds of connections that we need to have to earn the trust and respect of all the constituents that we want to have support us. So I think it's just part of what I feel strongly with as a parent and as a citizen of our country, but also and a citizen of the world. Also, I think it's good for our league. Yesterday, our office went to the Intrepid, and we had a volunteer day, and we packed meals for 9/11's Day of Service. The league office is doing those kinds of things on a monthly basis, as are our clubs and as are our players. Don't Cross the Line is our version of NBA Cares. I mean, think about the fact that in an environment where you have politically charged issues going on, we're having our players and our teams taking a stand against all sorts of things that we believe need to be supported: diversity, anti-bullying, anti-homophobia, and all those kinds of things. So that is something I'm very, very proud of. As it relates to the players, I was with Adam Silver. This can never be off the record, but I think he's earned me to talk about this publicly. And I saw him we're at a conference together, and I said to him, I really admire how they managed some of the issues that they had with players that were taking a stand with Black Lives Matter. And I thought the league did a great job in giving their players a platform that is owned by the league. It's not owned by the players. They are employees that day. And yet the league supported them wearing shirts, which are not part of the official uniform, and I admired that. Now, part of that is their player pool is very connected. NBA players are big advocates. It's the way they sort of have assumed this powerful position that they have. And MLS players have their own different things that they feel strongly about, whether it was Robbie Rogers, who was the first professional athlete in our country to be a regular starter and being an out gay player, and on and on and on. So I'll just say on our players, I don't think the league should mandate what they do and what they don't do. The league just needs to be open to providing them a free and open platform to be able to utilize free speech in a way that is appropriate. I'll finish, and I think you'll find this a negative, I'll finish with, when they're wearing their national team jersey, I don't feel the same way. And I didn't feel, as a board member for U.S. Soccer, that it was proper for players to kneel during the national anthem. Because when you get called to play for your country, you're wearing our flag, and you should be honoring the flag for both good and bad. But if any of our players were going to not stand for the national anthem in an MLS game, they would have had the right to do that. And I'm frankly proud that they didn't, but we would have supported that had they decided not to stand. Thank you very much, folks.
It's a great note to end on. Thank you to the Commissioner.
I want to say a huge thanks to Donnie and then a support.
Good job, Donnie.
Oh, well done, very well done. It's great to have you. And of course to Commissioner Garber. I'm really glad you asked that last question because I was actually going to mention that in my kind of closing remarks, that there's no one who's been a greater leader on all these topics with respect to what the role that we can play as a soccer community in our broader society. And I want to thank all of you for coming down. It was great to see a lot of familiar faces, but actually a lot of new faces that I don't recognize. And I want you to come back down to NYCFC House. We created this for our fans, for our club, to have discussions like these. Come enjoy the space. We're here through next week. And a big thanks to everyone else who put this on, and of course to MLS. So thanks very much for being here.